I wanted to start, for those in the audience who are midway through the book, haven't yet cracked it open, with a little synopsis, a fascinating metaphor taken from U.S. history, and the back of the $1 bill is Matthew Barzun's vehicle for introducing leadership principles based on traditional pyramid structures versus constellation thinking. Thanks in part to Franklin D. Roosevelt, the dollar bill depicts both a pyramid topped by the Eye of Providence and our nation's Great Seal, the familiar spread-winged eagle, where the original colonies are represented by a tiny constellation of 13 stars. A simple sketch illustrates Barzun's thesis that U.S. society should make the leap from leadership based on pyramid structures to the all-inclusive constellation approach. In the former, long favored in a country that champions rugged individualism, high-performing individuals take charge and lead by example. In the latter, everyone contributes organically to the whole, making big things together. To illustrate constellation thinking, Barzun provides profiles of influential Americans. All are his heroes, though some are little known today, like Charles Thomson, Secretary of Congress in 1776, Mary Parker Follett, an astonishing leadership consultant born in 1868, and noted 1960s urban planner Jane Jacobs. But he also tells the stories of other recent influencers, including Dee Hock, Visa, Jimmy Wales, Wikipedia, Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn, co-inventors of the internet, Lynn Twist, author of The Soul of Money, and President Barack Obama. Barzun served as Obama's National Finance Chair and later as U.S. Ambassador to Great Britain and Sweden, so a significant slice of the book tells of the story of candidate Obama's highly successful constellation-based fundraising. In addition to the usual scheme of high-dollar contributions by small groups of people, Obama and Barzun raised money by soliciting small sums, for example, $20 each, from much larger groups. According to Barzun, the constellation model was not merely part of a strategy to win the election, because that would have been the pyramid mindset. Instead, listening and sharing and being open was the campaign. It was both the means and the end. Drilling down on constellation thinking, Barzun borrows from Winston Churchill's famous post-World War II description of the U.S. and Great Britain as a special relationship to describe how fruitful friction is a way of creating space for our humanity. Citing a 2-year study by Google on the characteristics of highly successful business teams, Barzun emphasizes that the distinguishing factor of the best teams was interdependence. The more interdependent the team, the more it was a real team capable of high levels of effectiveness and not a mere work group. Barzun describes how he implemented the constellation mindset in his role as U.S. Ambassador to Great Britain using the mnemonic also. A, ask others about the hopes and fears. L, link them to our own. S, serve the relationship between us. O, open ourselves up. In the end, Barzun recasts the top 5 themes from traditional commencement speeches. Number 1, don't change the world, change your mindset. Number 2, don't just listen to your inner voice, share your inner voice. Number 3, don't just work hard, work through hard things together. Number 4, shed the phrase don't give up, instead give up power to make more. And finally, don't embrace failure, embrace uncertainty. Why don't we start with you telling us about that vehicle for introducing leadership principles, which is the analogy of the pyramid and the constellation.
Does anyone have a $1 bill?
That's what I was just going to ask. I meant to bring one in.
We're sort of cashless.
Bill on there?
Like a magic trick?
Nobody carries
It might be a magic trick.
Nobody carries cash anymore.
No one carries cash.
All right.
I used to always. Oh,
Yeah. Get another one.
that'd be good. Like, thank you. Yeah, no, so I should always have one with me. But back in 1776, there were 2 declarations made on July 4th in Philadelphia. The famous one, and then this other declaration, which is we need a logo. And so they do it, and they put Adams on it, and they put Franklin, and they put Jefferson, and these folks had just written the famous Declaration. And they got together, and how would these folks do with design? And they were pretty good with words. Terrible. And so they failed. They make their presentation. But the one thing they did contribute, two things. They contributed that it ought to have two sides, this logo, and they contributed the motto, E pluribus unum, out of many, one. But there were three failed committees, longer to design this logo than it did to win the war. And finally they do it. And for 150 years, they only ever used the front of it, which is the eagle, the arrows and the olive branches and the shield and all that stuff. Up until the depths of the Depression, when one of FDR's colleagues was kept waiting in the waiting room for the Secretary of State. And so like we all do if we're sitting there in the conference room, he just starts flipping through this book, and it was the centennial, 1876, 100 Years of America, and he's flipping through, and he sees a picture of the back of the seal, which had never ever been printed before and never used. And so he's like, oh my gosh, the boss is going to love this, right? Because it's a pyramid and it represents consolidated power, and my Latin is no good. But basically one of the Latin phrases on the back is it's like a new order for the ages, which this guy is like, it's kind of like the New Deal. So anyway, long story short, FDR is like, let's get this out. We need this pyramid out there. And so the Treasury people come to him, and they give him a dollar bill, which looks almost exactly like this one. Except if you were designing the back of the dollar bill, they did what I think we all would do, was you'd put the front of the seal first and then the back. If you go look at it, he's like, approved, and then he says, but put the pyramid first. And so the argument I would try to make in the book is, we have put the pyramid first, and the pyramid is the world of top down, in, out, ranking, rating, sorting, sifting. There is a time and place for that, absolutely, but we have put that at the front of our minds to get through the Depression, then World War II, then the Cold War, and we just keep defaulting to that. And we are ignoring this really powerful symbol that they finally came up after 7 years. They come up with, what is a symbol that allows you to be at once one and many? Are you many bricks in a pyramid where you have to fit in or be left out? Or can you be a star in a constellation? And of course, that's what they thought you ought to be. Now, obviously, and huge hypocrisy and falling short of that ideal at the time and ever since, but at least the idea of the fact that you could stand out as your own person, a star, and be part of something bigger, a constellation, was what we were supposed to do. Morgan, here's your dollar back. And George Washington, when he gets elected president, gets to name 5 Navy ships, and frigates, I think. And he doesn't name them after whimsical characters. He doesn't name them after corporate values. He doesn't do all the things he might have done. He is just right down the middle, super practical and tactical. The USS United States, the USS President, the USS Congress, the USS Constitution, and the USS Constellation. So that is how central it was to their idea of how we ought to think about ourselves and those around us.
Great, thank you. Tell us how that concept translated through Mary Parker Follett, who you describe as the guru's guru, and her concept of integration and keeping everyone at the table.
So Mary Parker Follett, I had this unwritten rule. I just couldn't have, sort of, to be slightly crass, too many dead guys in my book. Because I was a history major, and I love Charles Thomson is the guy who eventually came up, synthesized the constellation, and did all that. And so I just would sort of note in any given chapter, I was like, let's try to broaden it out a little bit. So on this particular chapter, I had hit a wall, and I was dying to quote Peter Drucker. And I don't know, he was probably the most quoted leadership management guru of the 20th century, and had some really wise things to offer. And I thought I had a perfect quote, but I had gone over my limit. And so I go onto Wikipedia, and I was like, just cruising around like we do. And then I'm reading in the things that he was listed by Harvard Business School as, they asked 200 business gurus, who's your guru? He was number one. And then right before he dies, he writes this essay, and he's like, I've had a guru all along, but I never said who she was. And her name is Mary Parker Follett. I was like, oh, this is so cool. Who is this amazing woman? Who is the guru's guru's guru? Born 1868, dies 1933. And she's this remarkable woman, and she would have gone, had it not, I mean, she wrote this amazing book when she was in her 20s. She went to what is now called Radcliffe. Anyway, she writes this amazing book. Everyone loves it. And if she were a man, she'd just go on to be a professor at Harvard, where she went, but that was not open to her. So she goes and does frontline social work in Roxbury, Massachusetts, right outside of Boston. And she has basically like a PhD in meetings by the end of it, because not only does social work, she says yes to every boring to me, civic subcommittee that Boston could throw at her. And a hardcore one, she's like on the minimum wage commission, like really hard, important stuff. And then she has this epiphany 25 years after she wrote her first book. And she's writing at a time, and it's relevant to all of us, she's writing, America's coming out of a global pandemic, huge debates about immigration, fear of big business, equal fear of government overreach and overregulation, social, racial, economic division everywhere she looked. And sort of then as now, it can all seem big and overwhelming. And I think one of her great insights was we can start to do something about it in really practical, small ways, like beginning tomorrow. And so she talks about meetings. And she says, and she'd been in a zillion of them, and she sort of said, look, forget what science says about the conservation of energy in closed systems. She's like, wherever people are gathered, energy is either created or killed. And we all know that. We know what that feels like. We know what it looks like in a group setting. And so she got really practical, and she said there's 4 possible outcomes of a meeting. Only one of them is worthwhile. And I'll do this quickly, I'm sorry. Bad outcome number 1, you try to win the meeting. You come in with a great idea and you want to leave the meeting with that idea. She's like, why are you even having a meeting? I mean, why are you inviting anyone else? That's no good. Number 2, bad outcome is the flip of that. You just acquiesce. It's like, oh, John or Morgan seems super pushy and fired up. Just let them win the day. It's like, no, that's no good, because you're denying the group a unique perspective, your own. Number 3, and this is tricky because all of us, I think, are taught to try to do what she cautioned against, which bad outcome number 3 is compromise. She's like, look, it sounds better than those first 2, but really it's just little victories and little acquiescences. It isn't, best case, you leave with part of what you came into the meeting with, but you don't leave with anything more. So the only reason she thinks we should ever gather around a table is for co-creation, to make something together. You might make a determination, you might make a plan, it doesn't matter. And she's like, this magic happens if you make anything together, which is you are part of that thing that was made. It is forever part of you. And you aren't diminished. You haven't sort of lost yourself in it in a bad way. You're enhanced by it, and so is everyone else in that meeting. And so the way I try to sum up what she could teach us today, who's dealing with similar seemingly big intractable problems and difficulties, is if we bring into every encounter 3 expectations. Expect to be needed, bring your whole self, expect to need others, and this is the most important, I think, that she teaches us, expect to be changed. Which is kind of a reciprocal, like, if you bring your whole self, which we should, there's a reciprocal obligation, I think, which is you have to leave that meeting just a little bit different than you came in. Because if you keep bringing that same truth to every meeting, you're not growing.
So shifting that concept to a place like our law firm, traditional business models for professional services firms have a particular challenge moving from independence and the pyramid mindset to interdependence. How might our firm encourage an interdependence mindset in the face of, say, things like traditional performance metrics, which measure an individual's contributions to the firm based on the amount of revenue they personally generate through billable hours?
Ooh, that's a good one and a hard one. I mean, the honest answer is I don't know, but let me pretend. No. So my brother's a law professor. My dad's a corporate lawyer who just retired. So I sort of feel like I'm close to it, but I mean, obviously I don't really know. But I think you start up with a lot of advantages, it seems to me, because my understanding, I mean, if you were a managing partner at a firm, people will say first among equals, but not mean it. But my sense from all of the law firms I've worked with, like, it actually feels that way. Sort of like the best of academia, like deans will rotate. They're not like your boss. I mean, they're taking on administrative duties on behalf of fellow professionals, not forever, for a while, and then someone else will do it. And so already you're starting with a nice, I'm a very visual thinker, so just a pattern of circles sitting around a table. I mean, it feels like stars. Like your stars, you have your expertise, you have your practice. You could be on your own with a shingle, but you've chosen not to be, and to be part of something bigger. So it seems, at least from the outside and at a high level of abstraction, pretty well set up to form constellations. And isn't it true? I mean, aren't law firms not allowed to? I mean, you can't be a corporate. I mean, it can't be run like a C corp, right? Or it can't be run like you can't have an accounting firm and a law firm and roll them all up and call it.
There's ownership.
Is that right? Yeah.
There are as Mandy said, there are ownership limitations.
Yeah.
Sort of like you have to have a medical license to run certain types of clinics. You can't, as a non-licensed physician, offer certain medical services. There's a similar mindset in the legal world. Now, some of that's changing, and people can do things like try to have a separate standalone that's maybe affiliated, where you're providing a suite of services, and then you can structure it where those don't become barriers. But generally, yes.
Because I think, I mean, in government, and so I used to be in business, right, and then went into government, and you'd often hear these things of like, I wish government could be more like business. And I mean, when you're dealing with a really ineffective, inefficient bureaucracy, like I get what we all mean when we say that, but then I'd sort of be like, oh, like government isn't, like business is fine, it is good for a bunch of things. I don't wish that pattern of behavior on other organizations that aren't developed that way. It's a little bit analogous, I think, when people, so I used to live, obviously, in San Francisco, and spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley, and they would do things when I was in Sweden or England, be like, they'd have these programs called Silicon Valley Comes to the UK. And it's like, we want the UK to do it. And I was like, hey, have you been there? I wouldn't wish that pattern of human interaction or physical development on anybody. Tiny little houses cost $4 million. It's a monoculture. It is, and you look at like beautiful England or Sweden, you're like, careful what you wish for. Like it comes with costs and consequences if you do that. And so anyway, I think that the worst part of business I mean, the first 3 words of the book are pretending is exhausting. And there's so much, I mean, we all know that, I think, in our own lives, how exhausting it can be, but just, there's something about the corporate pyramid, I think, mindset that just like pretends you know, and this is where Peter Drucker has a lot to offer. He gets famous in like the 1950s for coming up with a phrase, management by objective. And he had like studied General Motors, like post-World War II, sort of big corporate America. And so he gets famous for that. And then he kept, for the rest of his life, he was like, hey guys, management by objective, meaning work backwards from, X. He's like, it works really well if you know what your objective is, which 90% of the time we don't. 90%. So it's good 10% of the time. And then we often act as if all the machinery, key performance indicator, like all that kind of language comes from the 10% where you work your way backwards. And you factor out uncertainty to try to get to a thing. And again, that has a place. I mean, I think D-Day invasion, I bet that is probably a pretty effective pyramid to get all that stuff lined up. It works pretty well. But then you read all these accounts in history of what happened after the landing, watch the constellation bloom and people be clever and team up and do other weird things. NASA, I had a friend who worked at NASA. And he was like, yeah, getting a person on the moon, amazing triumph of the pyramid. Something like 11 years later, we couldn't get anyone back. It's kind of amazing. Like, it doesn't lead to anything more than the pyramid. It just leads to the pointy top, and then it ends.
Okay. So a follow-up question to that is a question you actually pose in the book. If constellations aren't single-mindedly in pursuit of profit, can they be profitable?
Yes, and this, I think, is probably the biggest misunderstanding that I get asked about the most. And in my original draft of it, I had many more examples from business, and the publisher was like, enough already. And I was like, no. I was like, I think, so in this book, I just basically talk about Visa, which happens to be, I sort of wish it weren't Visa, because Visa now is, so if you ask a group of people, like, it's associated with 23% APRs. I mean, it's become a brand that, credit card debt, it's just not a very happy thing. But the story of how it was created by this amazing guy, D-Hawk, who none of us have heard of, who, by the way, hated credit. And every time they said credit cards, he'd wince. He's like, that's not why I did this. He kept on getting fired from all the banks because he advised his clients not to go into debt. You know what I mean? So he's a really kooky, interesting guy who's still alive. But he loved just the friction-free empowerment of letting people cooperate and compete in a framework where big banks couldn't boss around little banks like his. That's sort of the triumph of it. And it's the biggest commercial organization in the world, measured by dollar or money transacted in a given year. So I had a whole bunch of other ones, like Airbnb, and there's like, so we cut them out. Because I think people are like, yeah, it's good for the internet, but it's enabled people to make money, but the internet itself doesn't make money. Wikipedia beat the richest company in the world, Microsoft, and one of the oldest companies in the world, Britannica, but it doesn't, make money. And so that, I think, so yes, it absolutely can. I mean, it does with Visa. It's one of the most profitable companies around. Airbnb is pretty amazing. And there are others, but now I want to kind of build up that list just so people can be like, oh, it's good for sort of .orgs and .nets, but not for commercial stuff.
So lawyers in general, and particularly litigators, often describe the results of their work before courts and administrative agencies as wins and losses. And when we're negotiating a contract or a deal, we often throw around the phrase compromise. Something, as you said, Follett rejected and said was a bad outcome. Do you see a way to apply the Constellation mindset to legal disputes and negotiations?
Ooh, that's really good, Rebecca. That's hard. That is a fun challenge. Probably not. I mean, so I used to do this little, I could hear my dad talking in the back of my head. So I used to do this exercise with, like, we'd get on the Obama campaign. We'd get 100 volunteers from Boston and Austin and San Diego, whatever. They'd come to Chicago every week, and we'd do a workshop-y kind of thing. And so we'd start off the day, and we'd be like, all right, what do you want to get out of today's 7 hours or whatever we're spending together? And then people would write it down, and we'd write it up on the butcher paper. And basically, like, 90% of the people, 100%, once everyone saw we want talking points so we can go back and win the argument in Austin, Boston, and San Diego on why you should support Obama and not whoever else. And the people who didn't write that, once they saw that, would be like, oh, no, forget what I said. I want to be armed with talking points. Like, okay, great. And then we'd say, well, quick show of hands, how many people here like to lose an argument? And except for, like, one sort of, contrarian in the back row. Like, no one ever raises their hand. And so we'd ask, like, well, so why are we in the argument-winning business? Now, realizing who I'm speaking to here, obviously there are really important times to win arguments, right? I just don't think politics is one of them. And so we would leave. It's like, look, we could, quote, arm you with talking points, but think about that language, arming. You know what I mean? Like, this is not a hunting exercise in politics. It is farming. Like, you are, so as the wonderful synopsis said, like, it's just not about being sharp and clever. And it is not about telling people they're wrong or telling people what you think. Just flip that whole thing. Ask them what they feel and watch what happens. It is much more effective. So, but that's in politics and in business. So I think in law, I mean, obviously you have to, the whole system is built adversarially and importantly so. But I think in deals, I mean, when I would deal with our lawyers in my CNET.com days, we were talking about this before we got started today, that I'd go around to all these law firms and there would very rarely be whiteboards. And I remember asking my father, I was like, why don't we have whiteboards in law firm offices? Because I spent all my time there and I'd love to draw on them. He's like, oh, we value words, Matthew. We don't like scribbling them and having them all erased and irregular. Like, we like them in Microsoft Word, and to the extent they aren't perfect, there's redlining to deal with that. And then we, you know what I mean? And so in a way, I think, you know, redlining a document together, you are making something together. You can think of it as compromise, of like, or you can think of it as like, look, I contributed this. I mean, well, tell me if you think this is an effective way to talk about compromise and why it isn't great and why we should shoot for something bigger. The example Follett uses, that I used to have in the book, and I thought it was not helpful, and I disagreed. So she says, this is 1924, I think she writes this, and so electrifying homes was still a thing that people thought about. So the example she uses is the electrical guy is coming to your house, this house you love, and you are going to finally get it electrified. And you have at some expense, right? So you've got a plan for how you want lights to be put in your house. And so you tell the guy, this is what I want. And the electrician guy is like, absolutely not. And you say, why not? And he's like, your house will burn down. Like, this is a terrible way to do it. He's like, I have a plan. I've done hundreds of these things. Here's what your lighting plan's gonna look like. And you look at the plan, you're like, absolutely not. He's like, why not? It's like, I can't live here. I mean, like, I'm paying you to ruin my house? I don't think so. And so you're like, okay, so two different, you know, he's got his electrician perspective, you've got, I live in this house and I love it. Imagine a compromise. And she's like, in a compromise, if you get half of what you want, like half your house is gonna burn down and half of your house is gonna look ugly and you don't wanna live in it. She's like, so what actually will happen in that, and she had done this, she and her wife, she was gay, had this house up in Vermont, that they lived in together. So they had been through this. And it's like, if you go back and forth and you're saying, well, what is it about my plan that's so dangerous? You know, you start to work through it together and you come up with a plan that isn't unsafe and looks lovely. Like, that is doable. There's not the same plan either one came into it with. It's something you did together. So I think on the working with lawyers as I have in my career, sort of internally, not adversarially, like, what should we do about blank? And it's kind of like, this is our lawyer's joke about himself and the law. He's like, look, we're in the avalanche spotting business. If it were up to us, no one should ever go skiing. But I get it, you need to go skiing.
Yes.
So let's sit and talk. So he's kind of the electrician in that perspective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm an employment law attorney, so when I was reading the book, my eyes naturally perked up a bit when a particular passage mentioned human resources, and I would like to read that and then ask you a question about it.
Ooh.
And this is what it says. There's a helpful phrase that has taken hold in corporate HR departments in the past decade. Diversity is a fact, inclusion is a choice. The point is that diversity is all around us and always has been, and acknowledging diversity is a first step, but not enough. Inclusion is an action, what we choose to do with the diversity. We need to actively include that diversity into our companies, our teams, our meetings, and so forth. Follett would tell us we should stop there, though. Not stop there. Yes, that's not nearly enough. Inclusion gets the right people to the table, and then the hard work begins. What we need to do is spark the energy and connection between people to make something that is bigger than any individual. She might amend the phrase as follows. Diversity is a fact, inclusion is a choice, co-creation is the work, interdependence is the promise. Can you talk about how we might adopt those concepts, particularly in the wake of what happened in 2020 with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others in what CNN described as the year America confronted racism?
So the I mean, is diversity is a fact, inclusion is a choice. Is that something that's said at Stites? I mean, is that a phrase that you all have heard talk about? Yeah. So it was coined by this guy, Stephen something, in London, and he was asked to be the head of diversity for the London 2012 Olympics. And he said, I am willing to do that job as long as you don't call it the head of diversity. I want to be the head of diversity and inclusion. And so he coined, and I think he was actually at KPMG or something, and he's a clever guy. And so that really stuck. It stuck with everyone who heard it, and it was like, oh, right. And he used to say, I got to hear him speak, he's like, diversity is a fact. I mean, look around. You know, again, as I say, like always has been. It's just we've chosen to factor out and ignore and disempower, you know, from the beginning of our country and all the way along. And so, so I think Follett's choice, and I saw this in my own life here in Louisville, mostly on Zoom, of the hard work. So if you are including and the right people and voices and experiences are at the table, then what? Right? And if everyone is like Louisville polite, which is not a compliment, sort of, right, just sort of like, oh, here we are. Let's awkwardly just try to get through this meeting together. Look around, it looks better than it did before. You haven't done the work. You know, so that's where I think that stuff we talked about earlier, the idea of bringing your full self to every meeting and creating psychological safety is the fancy word in those spaces, and that's what the Google thing discovered, that more than anything else. Was it the most diverse team that did well at Google? No. Was it the most sort of similar team? Nope. Was it the one with the most smart leader? Nope. Smart members? Nope. Ability to create psychological safety, ability to be real with one another was the single most important factor. So I think the way we can do that better is not being fake polite with each other, and not even saying, and this is controversial, but I believe, not saying phrases, and I know I've said this a lot, what unites us is far greater than what divides us, or some version of that. And the sort of rallies I go to, those signs are held up, right? So I know what we mean when we say that. I just think it leads to ignoring difference, sweeping it under the carpet. And what Mary Follett tells us is like, difference is where all the energy and the potential for growth lives. So constructively hear it, embrace it, and factor it in.
How do we adopt this constellation mindset in the face of social media algorithms and smartphones?
Ooh, these are good. These are hard questions. I mean, yeah, I mean, and I'm not, so I used to do all that tech stuff. So I have a deep, so I had this amazing session in London. We had a lot of young activists, American and British. So some of our own team at the embassy, and then British activists. This is like when Edward Snowden, all that stuff came out. So people were really pissed at America. It's like, you're all spying on us all the time. Basically that, you know. But I mean, and subtleties within that, and then some of the social media stuff back in 2013, not as much as it is now, but still awareness. Like, I don't trust any of these, and these are mostly American companies, American government with British complicity. I don't like it. So we had Vint Cerf, the guy who co-created the internet, co-invented the internet, come through London, and I didn't know him well. His amazing wife Sigrid is Swedish, so we had met when I was in Sweden. And so he was like, would you come and talk to these folks? He's like, sure. And he's a lovely guy. And so he's getting really hard, important questions, and he's handling them amazing. And I'm just sort of sitting where I am now, and you're Vint Cerf, and you're doing all the hard work, and I'm just calling on people. And then he said something like halfway through, he said, you know, hearing you talk about the internet, you talk about it like it's one big thing. And he's like, it's not one big, he's like, it's millions of little things. And then he said, he's like, it's not even a thing at all. And I was like, ooh, this is weird. He's like, you know, internet is a verb, where it used to be when we started it. He's like, I would just go ask people, would you like to internetwork with me? Like geeks. I mean, he was at DARPA, right, the Defense Research Project thingy, but he'd go to the people at USC or UCLA and be like, would you like to internetwork with me? And he's like, it was like asking someone to dance. I thought that was so kind of intimate and human. And if you've ever asked someone to dance, which I bet we all have, like, it's this sort of leap of faith, like they might say no. And he joked that, like, they said yes in Southern California, the UK said yes, France said no. Like, no interest in internetworking with you. It's like, oh, okay. Because they had a different, they thought, better system, which didn't really work. So this idea of technology at its core of the internet, that pattern being about human interaction and leaps of faith together to make something incredible, I still hold on to as not hopelessly lost and ruined by all the crap that we see every day. And I think what it's let us do, because there's bad friction in so much of office life and in life in general, that when we're given the chance to automate or replicate something, we leap at that chance because we'd much rather just have routine transactions, right? Just eliminate friction. So you can, through your social media platform, wish anyone you have ever met in the history of your life happy birthday with zero effort. And when you receive one of those zero effort happy birthday Matthew, you attribute like almost no value to it. So that's sort of, I think, just a small example of like super easy, no effort. And so there's a catch and a cost to friction-free interactions. And so the part I talk about Churchill in the book of just like, what is the opposite of a routine transaction? And I would say special relationship, which is another way of saying psychological safety. Like, seek out friction and make it fruitful. That's the kind of key.
Some in the audience may not know that you come from a long line of intellectuals. Your grandfather was Jacques Barzun, who Wikipedia describes as a French-American historian living from November 30th, 1907 through October 25th, 2012, who was known for his studies of the history of ideas and cultural history. He wrote about a wide range of subjects, including baseball, mystery novels, and classical music, and was also known as a philosopher of education. In the book Teacher in America, written in 1945, he influenced the training of school teachers in the United States, and in fact, he has influenced our legal writing. Here at Stites, we have a persuasive legal writing outline used as part of our Stites University program, which begins by quoting him. Nobody should suppose that good writing, the kind that says what it means while being pleasant to read, has ever been easy. What influence, if any, did your grandfather have on your book?
Oh, it's so fun to talk about him. So that's the quote that starts out the
Our legal writing,
That's
yeah.
really good. He also said, I don't know if you're doing the math, so he died at 104 and 11/12ths. Which my kids were like, you should just say 105. He was so close. But so every time I saw him for like the last, I don't know, 15 years of his life, I always thought it would be the last time. I mean, he was always sort of like super old there towards the end, like 99, 100, 101. And he, and so I did share with him before he died that, like, I want to write at some point. He's like, yeah, you should just know, do you want to have written or do you want to write? He's like, a lot of people want to have written. And I was like, ooh, okay, I don't know, but I'll think about that. And then he said, and you shouldn't even call it writing. It's rewriting. And you all know that because you do that all the time. He's like, writing, people wonder why it isn't pleasant to read and make any sense when you first do it. It rarely does. So it's really the act of rewriting. And I'm sort of like, it would be really nerve-wracking if he were alive to actually have him, read that. You know what I mean? And it's like, I don't write the way he does. And it's not my voice or style. But I discovered this wonderful essay he wrote sort of towards the end of his life. He never talked about his feelings. He didn't talk about, he was quite formal. And, but he reveals in this really short essay that when he was 11 years, he was born in France during World War I. And at 11 years old, his parents discovered that he was suicidal. Because everyone, he was an only child, and everyone he knew, all these grown-ups were his friends. His parents ran an artist salon in Paris, and all these people would either not come back because they were killed. Like a third of men in France died in that war. So they either didn't come back or they came back what they call shell-shocked. So we'd say PTSD, either physically and mentally really hurt. And so he's like, this is awful. And there were accusations of everyone spying. It was awful. So he's basically on the verge of suicide, and the parents freak out. So they send him away out of the city to go up to Normandy. And he just grabs a few books to take with him, and he grabs Hamlet. I love, he's like an 11-year-old kid reading Hamlet, that he was that kind of guy. And he's like, wow, Hamlet had a really confusing, awful world around him, and he somehow could manage this confusion. And then he said, and this is, I've read, he wrote 40 books, and I've like read all of them, and I was sort of a fan of his. And then he said, so I made a determination in my life to fight the mechanical. And I just reread this the other day, fight the mechanical. And he's like, I don't mean machines. He's like, machines only tyrannize with our permission. It's people who tyrannize other people, with machines or without them. And he said, I'm just going to fight the mechanical thinking and in any and every way. And his first book was on race in 1937. And he was saying back then, for the outbreak of World War II, this kind of race thinking and, which now we know a lot more about and have lots more work to do. But he's like, that is mechanical thinking. You know what I mean? That is not... And so it was helpful for me to see, and in a way, the thread I try to connect to this is what I call the pyramid mindset is really the mechanical mindset. And I remember I was, at the end of the book, I gave a talk about something that was related to the themes we're talking about here today, about how we cannot wake up every day and think of ourselves in this pyramid world of top down and even bottom up. And I know bottom up, sort of, especially in my political party, is a phrase we use a lot. And it feels good for a second. And I think bottom up is nearly as bad. Because think about it for a second. Top down, like barking orders from the top, like we've all got the memo. That is not that effective. And disempowering and kind of awful. Lording power over other people, not a good idea. So bottom up feels better. But if I tell you, Stites and Harvest, like, we're going to initiate a bottom up, you have one of only two choices. You are either looking around at your colleagues as beneath you, or you are looking around and you are beneath them. What an awful way to look at a fellow human being, as above you or beneath you. And you don't have to look at yourself that way. You can look at yourself, think of yourself as a star, and see other stars, and how can we make connections to build something more useful, more powerful than we ever could alone, constellation and all that. So anyway, I do some version of that in this talk. Then I walk to the luncheon by the sponsors, and I said, and it just makes you feel, KPIs, all this stuff, just makes you feel like you're a cog in a machine. You're just a gear. Like, how gross. And so I go, and the new corporate logo is just a giant pyramid with gears in it, if you can see that.
And we should recognize that
We're
logo,
all
right?
familiar
Yeah.
with that logo,
Yeah.
Matthew, even though you did not.
If you're in
name the
Louisville.
organization.
I did not
Yeah.
name the
As soon as
organization.
I saw it, I knew exactly what you were.
And I love that
referring to.
organization, and I
do too.
did that program, and I just thought, that's a choice, a pyramid with gears. By the way, the Humana building, have you walked into the bottom of the Humana building? Check it, the big, beautiful.
Yes, it's right
Over there.
It's right there.
Yeah.
And I walked in there pre-COVID, and I walk in, there is at great expense this huge statue of 3 gears, huge gears, and a disembodied hand about to go into it, like a meat grinder. I was like, that's so weird. Just like, welcome to work, everybody. So I'm like weirdly sensitive, right? Where like you put that thing in motion, it's not going to end well. And I think it's so interesting, that choice. Like that's, and I learned a quote that's not in the book because I just learned it at the beginning of this week. Aristotle said this, allegedly, or wrote it. The soul never thinks without an image. The soul never thinks without an image. I don't know why he said that. I have to go find out where, but I think that's really cool. And that's sort of what I realized, like, we all have these images in our head, whether we express them or not, and they come with our thoughts and feelings. And so what image we have in our head, is it a pyramid? Is it a bunch of gears? Is it a constellation? I think have much bigger impact. It isn't just sort of like just an image. Like, those have real power, positive or negative.
I have one last question, and then we'll let everybody else ask their questions. You are challenging a lot of long-standing perspectives and beliefs with this work. What kind of impact do you hope it will have?
I go back to the pretending is exhausting. The amount, if we could quantify the exhaustion and the pretending that happens every single day, corporations, law firms, nonprofits, family, like, it would be so immense. And that there is an ability, back to sort of meetings, like wherever we are gathered, to, with a little mindset shift, little but really important, start kindling and creating energy and power with and through one another, as opposed to smothering it and killing it. And I think, and we all know that subtle change, and we can all do it. And the William James, who's a wonderful, who I wrote my senior thesis on in college, had this great, he's the sort of philosopher, so he's sort of just, he's like the father of psychology and the first sort of true American philosopher, maybe, with pragmatism. And he's the guy who said, you know, you think you smile because you're happy. And he did all these labs. He's like, you actually are happy because you smile. It's not, which is kind of weird, and not the point that I wanted to make. But he says, in pragmatism, he's like, look, there are a whole bunch of things in life that what you think and feel about them make no difference. And he's like gravity. Like, the apple's gonna fall from that tree, whether you like really hope it doesn't. You know, like, you just have no meaningful impact on that. He's like, but there are a whole bunch of things in our life where what you think about it really will change what the outcome is. And his example is, in a, so imagine a dating relationship, doesn't have to be, it could be any relationship, but if you just said, you know what, I am gonna withhold trust from this person until they show me trust. Totally rational. And just picture the act of just sort of like, he's like, totally rational, totally great. The act of you withholding trust until they show it has a meaningful impact and will greatly reduce the chance of trust being extended to you. If, on the other hand, you decide to extend trust to someone before they do it to you, you greatly enhance the chance that you, no guarantee. So it's these little leaps that we have to take of like, I'm gonna do it even though I have no guarantee it's gonna come back. And those little leaps we take every day with one another as colleagues. And if we can encourage more leaping, that added up over time can make a huge, huge difference.
Great.
I hope, and I think, and I feel.
Yeah. Who has questions? Joe. Well, Joe, I saw your
John, if
hand
you don't mind,
first.
we'll Joe there here,
And then we'll,
and then you, and then everybody else. I mean, this is intended to be interactive.
So two things.
So just to summarize, so we can get it on the video. So 2 questions. One is, with your worldview, do you see the American democracy as being under attack more so than it has been in the past? And secondarily, do you view the constellation mindset as something that could help with that?
Yes, thank you. Remember how I was saying, like, Vint Cerf said the internet is a verb? And I think sort of democracy is a verb, or it ought to be. And we've sort of lost the habits of interdependence. right? And I think that word is so loaded, interdependence. Like you say it, especially here in Kentucky, like for a whole bunch of people love it without even thinking, like, oh yes, I'm one of those. A bunch of other people, it's code for sort of group hug, touchy-feely, like not my action. You know what I mean? And so, although I think it is the right word and what democracy is about, but if it's not a helpful word, maybe we... So here's another way to think about it without using that word. But yes, I agree with you. We are in a really unpleasant time in our democracy. If I played a little game, we'll all get the answer right. I feel pretty confident. Two cars in the garage. Parking lot. The game is guess the Democrat's car and guess the Republican's car. Okay. Now they're not a blue Prius and a red Ford F-150. So I'm not going to make it easy. They're identically boring gray cars, and they only have one bumper sticker each, and that bumper sticker only has one word on it. Okay. Car number one, freedom. Car number two, together. Right? We all got it, right? Okay. So freedom is Republican, together is Democrat. My adult lifetime, being 20 years, I don't think I'm 20 years younger than you, but 10 years later, my whole adult lifetime has been a fight between those two bumper stickers, the freedom crowd and the together crowd. And we have seen recently, to your point, both of those taken to the extreme. So the freedom is freedom from, you can put a COVID lens on this, just leave me the heck alone. Right? Just, okay, got it. The together taken to its logical extreme is just tell me what the heck to do. And that, they'll say herd immunity in a way that makes it almost sound like we're a herd of cattle, right? Which will make the freedom crowd be like, exactly, I don't want to be, I'm not cattle. I am a human being and I do not want to be treated that way. So totally leave me alone and just tell me what the heck to do and I'll comply. And what I think we want and what we desperately need is freedom together. Not some mushy compromise, not some middle of the road, like freedom together, whether it's COVID or anything else. That was what, for all their faults and for all the hypocrisy, the American idea at the founding, the best part of it was freedom together. Anyone can declare independence. Any band of revolutionaries, not that hard. Figuring out how we can, big states, small states, all that stuff, how can we possibly get along and work together, competing and cooperating? That's the big, wonderful idea that we fall short of and should keep striving for. How can you have unity without demanding uniformity? How do you have all the energy and potential power from diversity without succumbing to division? That's the thing. And their image of it was a constellation, right? Not a pyramid. And we just keep defaulting to this awful pyramid thing where it's win or lose, win or lose.
So what's next for Matthew Barzun? You might have another 50 years if your grandfather...
Plus.
I know it is. I mean, 104 and a half. It's like I didn't tell you about the others in the family. Their death dates begin with 6s and stuff like that. So I think on average... it's weird. I have my own. I was a website guy for a long time, so I loved website. And I'd go out and buy domains. Like we bought news.com and search.com. That was like in my 20s, a fun, weird thing that I did on the side, and it was fun. And now I have MatthewBarzun.com, which is such a strange and sort of lovely feeling. It's like, oh, like that's my just exactly my name, like Matthew Barzun at Gmail. Like Morgan said, like there I am, still my email. If you want to have thoughts that you'd like to share, ideas. And I don't feel drawn to politics. I think the fights in politics are hugely important, and I've been involved in them. And I don't feel my calling right now is to do that. It just, and Mary Follett, this amazing mentor of mine who I met through Wikipedia, when she had that epiphany and she wrote her amazing book about coming out of a pandemic and how we can start healing and everything, the first thing she did was cancel the debating society that she had started 25 years before. She's like, I just don't want to encourage people to fight with words. She knew, just like I do, and we all do, that there is a role and a time and a place for that, especially with this wonderful group. But there's another way to use words. And Here's a weird thought to maybe close with if we,
Sure.
it's a little strange. Do we have sports fans here? Okay, this
Yes.
is weird. Okay, I assume so. I'm gonna take us away from red, blue, and UK and U of L. I'm gonna transport you to another red, blue fight where I come from. There is a men's bathroom between New York and Boston on I-95. And someone next to the mirror wrote, "Yankees suck." And I agree. And then someone scribbled it out and wrote, "Red Sox suck." And they scribbled it out and they wrote, "Yankees suck." So it's like this much of the wall, right? And you can just picture it, right? So then this guy comes along and he circles the whole kind of diatribe in a green Sharpie and he writes, "And we all love baseball." Now, this I think gets to Joe's point. I think a good way for amazingly smart lawyers of different generations to think about. Okay, so I think, I did not go back. I do not know. My strong hunch, and I think you would agree, is Mr. Green Sharpie settled absolutely nothing. And I bet there is added commentary about what Mr. Green Sharpie can do with his pen. Because even though when you're like, oh, yeah, there's something about that, we all love baseball, he is not validating the legitimate sports tribal animosity between the Red Sox and the Yankees. So he sort of reveals himself, I assume it's a man, reveals himself as like, you're not in this. You're sort of condescendingly making fun of our tribal dispute here on the wall. And so, and the reason I mention that is like, there's something, this can be misunderstood. This sort of constellation message can be misunderstood and is misunderstood as some kind of, oh, total together, group hug, we all love baseball, put on a smiley face. It's like, no, not at all. Like, that's not gonna do anything. No energy lives there. And you're just gonna alienate all the Red Sox and Yankees fans. Like, how did we get there? So what I wish I would go back and write, and this is where you all come in, with a different color Sharpie, ask the following. This is sort of a baseball geeky thing, but right on the wall, should the American League eliminate the designated hitter, ? Now, that is an interesting discussion. Like, I don't know, like Red Sox and Yankees fans could disagree about it. You could get two Yankees fans, but you're crazy. No, you're crazy. Like, it's just a different conversation. But it gets back to Joe's point. This would be a discussion, debate, but let's say discussion. Like, I don't know, should we? We have a good one now, but he's not gonna last forever. Like, maybe it is the right, that is people discussing and debating the rules of a game they love at a level of practicality that is meaningful. Democracy lives there. And I think it was telling that a year ago, right as COVID happened, there was one more debate. CNN, I think, had one scheduled between Bernie Sanders and Biden. They were the last two remaining, as you remember, on the Democratic side. And the newspaper articles were like, well, there are two choices. Continue it and have those two guys debate with no audience, even though the math was, Bernie wasn't going to win, or cancel it, right? And I remember I wrote to nothing happened of this, but I got all sort of fired up one morning because I was finishing this up. And I was like, no. There's a third choice. You already have the TV time booked. Why don't you have Joe Biden show up, Bernie Sanders show up, Elizabeth Warren show up, Kamala Harris show up, all the people who were on the stage and then had left for various reasons. Bring them all back and don't have a debate. Bring them all back and have Joe, who's the presumptive nominee, say to Elizabeth Warren, you're really smart. I know you think I am being either wimpy or naive or something about what I think about healthcare and why I'm not willing to go as far as you are in terms of single payer. And I really, tell me what I am missing. What am I misunderstanding? How disarming. She'd be like, I'll tell you, Joe. And then he could go around and ask all these really smart people with different experiences from him to challenge him in a thoughtful, constructive, respective way. And everyone's like, that would be terrible television. I was like, really? I don't think this other kind of television is necessarily the high watermark for what's going on. Like, so maybe it's boring, but like, it's real. But that doesn't seem like totally crazy that you could do something like that. Like, we all know what it feels like if you can get around a room and have a constructive conversation with tension, with disagreement, and make it fruitful. We just have to do that, whether it's in a men's bathroom about the designated hitter, or it's on a stage of CNN, or it's in a conference room here at Stites. That's what I'm hoping we will do more of.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you so
It was a
much.
great pleasure.